Chapter 30 of Cairo to Kisumu by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Uganda Railway. Traveling by railway through the wilds of East Africa, steaming for hundreds of miles among zebras, gnus, ostriches, and giraffes, rolling along through jungles which are the haunts of the rhinoceros and where the lion and the leopard wait for their prey. These were some of my experiences during my trip over the Uganda Railway from Mombasa to Nairobi. Only a few years ago it took a month to cover the distance between these two points. Today I made it in less than 24 hours, and that in a comfortable car. The railroad fare, traveling first class, was 58 rupees, which at normal exchange would total about $30, and I had good meals on the way. The distance is over 300 miles, just about half the length of the railroad. Wood-burning locomotives of the American type are largely used. The maximum scheduled speed is 25 miles an hour. Trains leave Mombasa daily for Nairobi and 3 times a week for Kisumu on Lake Victoria, which is 584 miles from Mombasa. Leaving Mombasa, our train carried us across a great steel bridge to the mainland, and we climbed through a jungle up to the plateau. We passed baobab trees with trunks like hogsheads, bursting out at the top into branches. They made me think of the frog who tried to blow himself to the size of a bull and exploded in the attempt. We went through coconut groves, by mango trees loaded with fruit, and across plantations of bananas, whose long green leaves quivered in the breeze made by the train as it passed. Now we saw a gingerbread palm, and now strange flowers and plants, the names of which we did not know. As we went upward we could see the strait that separates Mombasa from the mainland, and higher still caught a view of the broad expanse of the Indian Ocean. For the first 100 miles the climb is almost steady, and we were about 1/3 of a mile above the sea when we reached the station at Bwa. Here the country is more open, and far off in the distance one can see a patch of snow floating like a cloud. That patch is the mountain of Kilimanjaro, the top of which is more than 19,000 feet above the sea. It is the loftiest mountain on the continent, yet is not much higher than Mount Kenya, that other giant of British East Africa, which rises out of the plateau some distance north of Nairobi. After the jungle of the coastline, the country becomes comparatively open and soon begins to look like parts of America, where the woods have been cut away and the brush allowed to grow up in the fields. Here the land is carpeted with grass about a foot or so high. Thousands of square miles of such grass are going to waste. I saw no stock to speak of, and at that place but little wild game. Without knowing anything about the tsetse fly and other cattle pests, I should say that the pastures just back of the coast might feed many thousands of cattle and hogs. The soil seems rich. It is a fat clay, the color of well-burnt brick, which turns everything red. The dust filled our car, it coated our faces, and crept through our clothes. When we attempted to wash, the water soon became a bright vermilion, and the towels upon which we dried were brick red. My pillow, after I had traveled all night through such dust, had changed from white to terracotta, and there was a Venetian red spot where my head had lain. The wisest travelers cleansed eyes and nostrils several times a day with an antiseptic solution. It is a strange thing to go to sleep in the woods and then awake to find oneself rolling over a high, treeless country with game by the thousand gamboling along the car tracks. We awoke on the Kapiti Plains, which are about a mile above the sea and 268 miles from Mombasa. These plains are of a black sandy loam and covered with a thick grass. They look much as Iowa, Kansas, or Nebraska did when the railroads were first built through them and the buffaloes galloped along with the cars. The same conditions prevail here, save that the game is of a half dozen big kinds, and most of it is such as one can see only in our zoological gardens at home. According to law, no shooting may be done for a mile on each side of the track, so that the road has become a great game preserve 2 miles in width and about 600 miles long. The animals seem to know that they are safe when they are near the railroad, for most of them are as quiet as our domestic beasts when in the fields. Let me give you some notes which I made with these wild animals on all sides of me. I copy. These Kapiti Plains are flat, and I am riding through vast herds of antelopes and zebras. Some of them are within pistol shot of the cars. There are 50 odd zebras feeding on the grass, not 100 feet away. Their black and white stripes shine in the sunlight. Their bodies are round, plump, and beautiful. They raise their heads as the train goes by and then continue their grazing. Farther on we see antelopes, some as big as 2-year-old calves and others the size of goats. The little ones have horns almost as long as their bodies. There is one variety which has a white patch on its rump. This antelope looks as though it had a baby's bib tied to its stubby tail or had been splashed with a whitewash brush. Many of the antelopes are yellow or fawn colored, and some of the smaller ones are beautifully striped. Among the most curious animals to be seen are the gnus, which are sometimes called wildebeest. As I write this, there are some galloping along with the train. They are great beasts as big as a moose, with the horns of a cow and the mane and tail of a horse. Hunting them is good sport. But look, there are some ostriches. The flock contains a dozen or more birds, which stand like interrogation points away off there on the plain. They turn toward the cars as we approach, then spread their wings and skim away at great speed. Giraffes are frequently seen. They are more timid than the antelope and by no means so brave as the zebras. The Uganda Railway begins at the Indian Ocean and climbs over some of the roughest parts of the African continent before it ends at Lake Victoria, one of the two greatest freshwater lakes of the world. Leaving the seacoast, the rise is almost continuous until it reaches the high plains of Kenya Colony. Here at Nairobi, where this chapter is written, I am more than a mile above the sea, and about 15 miles farther on, at the station of Kikuyu, the road reaches an altitude 700 feet above the top of Mount Washington. From there, the ascent is steady to a point a mile and a half above the sea. Then there is a great drop into a wide, ditch-like valley 2,000 feet deep. Crossing this valley, the railway again rises until it is far higher than any mountain in the United States east of the Rockies. It attains an elevation of 8,300 feet and then falls down to Lake Victoria, which is just about as high as the highest of the Alleghanies. The line was built by the British government in less than 5 years and has cost altogether some $35 million. It has a gauge of 40 inches, rails which weigh 50 pounds to the yard, and tracks which are well laid and well ballasted. In an average year, almost 250,000 tons of goods and 500,000 passengers are carried over it, and its earnings are more than its operating expenses. It does not yet pay any interest on the capital invested, but it is of enormous value in the way of opening up, developing, and protecting the country. It was not constructed as a commercial project, but to combat the slave trade, which flourished beyond the reach of the British warships. Today, the Uganda line is the dominant influence of Kenya Colony. Among the most interesting features are the American bridges, which cross all the great ravines between Nairobi and Lake Victoria. Every bit of steel and every bolt and rivet in them was made by American workmen in American factories and taken out here and put up under the superintendence of Americans. This was because of John Bull's desire to have the work done quickly and cheaply and at the same time substantially. While he had been laying the tracks from here to the sea, our bridge companies had surprised the English by putting up the steel viaduct across the Atbara River in the Sudan within a much shorter time and far more cheaply than the best British builders could possibly do. Therefore, when the British government asked for bids for these Uganda bridges, they sent the plans and specifications to the English and to some of our American firms as well. The best British bids provided that the shop should have 2 or 3 years to make the steel work and longer still to erect it in Africa. The American Bridge Company offered to complete the whole job within 7 months after the foundations were laid, and that at a charge of $90 per ton to be paid when all was in place and in working order. This price was about half that of the British estimates, and the time was less than 1/3 that in which the 8 bridges already constructed had been built, so the American company got the contract. It carried it out to the letter, and had the government done its part, the work would have been completed in the time specified. Owing to delays of one kind and another, it really consumed 5 months longer, but it was all done within the space of 1 year, which was just about half the time that the British contractors asked to get their goods ready for shipment. The English were surprised at how easily and quickly the Americans carried out their contract and how little they seemed to make of it. A.B. Luter, the civil engineer who was sent out to take charge of the construction, was little more than a boy and had graduated at Cornell University only a year or so before. There were about 20 bridge builders and foremen from different parts of the United States, and a Pennsylvania man named Jarrett who acted as superintendent of construction. Arriving at Mombasa in December, 1900, these men had completed their work before the following Christmas. They acted merely as superintendents and fancy workmen. All the rough labor was done by East Indians and native Africans, furnished by the British. When the road was started, the government planned to use only Africans, but finding this impossible, they imported 20,000 coolies from India. The coolies came on contracts of from 2 to 5 years at wages of from $4 to $15 a month and rations. The native laborers were paid about 10 cents a day. Before the workmen from the United States arrived here, a large part of the bridge material was already in Mombasa. The Americans left one man there to see that additional materials were forwarded promptly and came at once to the scene of action. They put up the bridges at the rate of something like one a week and constructed the longest viaduct in 69½ working hours. What they did forms one of the wonders of civil and mechanical engineering. The bridge material was so made that its pieces fitted together like clockwork, notwithstanding the fact that it was put into shape away off here, thousands of miles from the place of construction and in one of the most uncivilized parts of the world. The materials in the viaducts included about 500,000 feet of southern pine lumber and over 13 million pounds of steel. The steel was in more than 100,000 pieces, and the heaviest piece weighed 5 tons. The average weight was about 100 pounds. The greatest care had to be taken to keep the parts together and in their own places. Every piece was numbered, and those of different bridges were painted in different colors. At that, it was hard to keep all the parts together, for, since most of the natives here look upon steel as so much jewelry, it was all but impossible to keep them from filching some of the smaller pieces for ear bobs and telegraph wire to make into bracelets. Besides all the other tremendous difficulties in building this road, there were the wild beasts. There are 100 places along it where one might get off and start up a lion. Rhinoceroses have butted the freight cars along the track and infest much of the country through which it goes. I was shown a station yesterday where 29 Hindus were carried off by 2 man-eating lions. Night after night the man-eaters came, taking away each time 1 or 2 of the workmen from the construction camp. They were finally killed by an English overseer who sat up with his gun and watched for them. It was not far from the station of Nairobi that a man was taken out of a special car while it stopped overnight on the side track. The windows and doors of the car had been left open for air, and the 3 men who were its only inmates had gone to sleep. 2 were in the berths while the other, who had sat up to watch, was on the floor with his gun on his knees. As the night went on he fell asleep and woke up to find himself under the belly of a lion. The beast had slipped in through the door, and jumping over him, seized the man in the lower berth and leaped out of the window, carrying him along. The other 2 men followed, but they failed to discover the lion that night. The bones of the man, picked clean, were found the next day. An interesting byproduct of the construction of the Uganda road has been the development of the native laborer. 20 years ago the saying was, "Native labor is of little value. No dependence can be placed upon it, and even famine fails to force the tribesmen to seek work." Today that opinion has yielded to the belief that if he is properly trained and educated to it, the native can supply labor, skilled and unskilled, for all manufacturing and industrial enterprises of Kenya colony. Remarkable progress in industrial education is shown by the 9,000 African workers on the Uganda line. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Cairo to Kisumu by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The capital of Kenya Colony. Nairobi is the capital and administrative center of Kenya Colony, one of the most interesting and prosperous of Great Britain's African possessions. It lies 327 miles from the sea in the very heart of British East Africa, about halfway between the Indian Ocean and Lake Victoria. It is situated on a plateau at an altitude higher than Denver, with mountains in sight far above any we have in Colorado. When the sun is just right at Nairobi, I can get a glimpse here of Mount Kilimanjaro, and I can plainly see the peak of Mount Kenya. Kilimanjaro is about 150 miles distant, and Kenya, as the crow flies, not more than 100 miles. It is from Mount Kenya that Kenya Colony is named. Mount Kenya is one of the giants of the African continent and is only 3,000 feet lower than our own Mount McKinley. It is a dead volcano and is supposed to have once been 3,000 feet higher than it is now. The great peak, seamed with no less than 15 glaciers, is a mass of rocks covered with snow, but the lower slopes are heavily wooded with forests of cedar, camphor, and bamboo. Above the woods are pastures fit for sheep, while in and below them are all sorts of wild game, including lions and elephants, and even rhinoceroses and hippopotami. In some respects, Nairobi reminds one of our frontier towns of the West. The high plain upon which it is situated has a climate in which white men can live and work the year around, and farms are springing up almost everywhere. The city is comparatively new. 15 or more years ago it had hardly a house. Today streets have been laid out over an area 10 miles in circumference, and hundreds of buildings of tin, wood, and stone have been erected. The chief building material is galvanized iron, which is so prevalent that Nairobi has been nicknamed the Tin City. There are no sawmills or planing mills worth mentioning, as the forests have not been exploited, and about the only lumber available is that brought from the United States and Norway and landed at Mombasa. The ocean freight rates are heavy, and in addition there is the cost of bringing the lumber to Nairobi by railroad. Hence the galvanized iron, which comes here in sheets from England and Belgium. Almost all the buildings are of iron, put up just as it comes from the factory, giving the whole town a silver gray color. The post office is of iron, the depot has an iron roof, and the same is true of the governor's offices. Many of the houses have iron ceilings and iron walls, and the chief retail business section is a collection of one-story iron booths, open at the front, in which Hindus stand or sit surrounded by their goods. My hotel is half iron. The government treasury nearby, a shed not over 15 feet square, is of tin and has a tin roof. I could chop it to pieces with a butcher knife, and the only sign of policing about it is the Negro who, gun in hand, stands outside guarding the door. The office of the land surveyor is of tin, and so are the police headquarters and the house where the Supreme Court is held. The more fancy dwellings are now being painted, and some stone and brick buildings are rising. The Nairobi of today is largely cow pastures. It is a city of magnificent distances. All the places of importance seem to be several miles from each other, and the patches between are often grazing ground. The houses are of 1 and 2 stories and are scattered along wide streets which run for an indefinite distance out into the prairie. The chief ways of getting about are on foot, on horseback, or in jinrickshas, the last being by far the most popular. The jinrickshas are much like those used in Japan, save that they are larger and wider. I am told they are made in America. They are pushed and pulled by black Africans, 2 to each vehicle. One man goes in the shafts and the other pushes behind. They are each clad in a single cotton cloth which flaps back and forth as they run, exposing their nakedness. The streets are unpaved and frequently masses of dust. Along many of them eucalyptus trees have been planted and have grown so rapidly that most of the roads are now shaded by this mournfully drooping foliage. The population of Nairobi is about 20,000, of which only a tenth are Europeans. Of the remainder, about a third are Asiatics from Hindustan, and the others are the queerest Africans one can imagine. I speak of them first because they are everywhere. One stumbles over them on the street. They wait upon him in the hotels, they carry burdens for him, and clog his footsteps when he goes outside the town. Many of them wear dirty, greasy cloths, not more than a yard wide and 2 yards long. They hang them about their shoulders and let them fall down on each side so that they flap this way and that in the breeze. Some wear breechcloths, and not a few are bare to the waist. In the early morning, when the air is still sharp, many of these people, clad in red flannel blankets, go stalking along with their legs uncovered to the thighs. I have already spoken of the earplugs. Some have the holes in the lobes of their ears so stretched that I can put my fist through them. The loops are so long that when a man takes out his earplug, he hangs the loop of skin over the top of his ear to prevent its catching on something and tearing. The loop looks just like a leather strap about as wide as one's little fingernail. I have handled many of them, twisting them this way and that to be sure they were genuine. The African smell is everywhere. It burdens the air of the marketplaces, and I verily think it might be chopped up into blocks and sold as a new kind of phosphate. The natives cover themselves with hair oil and body grease, and the combination of this when it turns rancid with the natural effluvia which exhales from their persons is indescribable. Some of the blacks smear their faces with a mixture of grease and red clay, and cover their hair with the same material, so that they look more like copper Indians than Africans. These Africans do all the hard work of Nairobi. They are hewers of wood and drawers of water. I see scores of them carrying baskets of dirt on their heads and bundles of wood on their backs, and pushing and pulling carts and wagons through the streets. Most of my trips from one place to another are made in two-wheeled carts hauled by wire-bedecked natives. The retail business is done by East Indians, as is also the case at Mombasa. I am told this is so in every settlement on this part of the continent. The Hindus have made their way along all the traveled routes until their little stores may be found in every large African village. They have trading stations upon Lakes Victoria and Tanganyika. They are very enterprising, and as they live upon almost nothing, they can undersell the whites. They sell cotton of bright colors and of the most gorgeous patterns, wire for jewelry, and all sorts of knickknacks that the African wants. They deal also in European goods, and one can buy of them almost anything from a needle to a sewing machine. Here at Nairobi there is an Indian bazaar covering 9 acres, which is quite as interesting as any similar institution in Tunis, Cairo, Bombay, or Calcutta. The stores are all open at the front, and the men squat in them with their gay goods piled about them. These Hindus dress in a quaint costume not unlike that of the English clergyman, who wears a long black coat buttoned up to the throat. The only difference is that the Hindu's trousers may be a bright colored calico, cut very tight, and his head may be covered with a flat skull cap of velvet embroidered in gold. Moreover, his feet are usually bare. But Nairobi is a British city, notwithstanding its African and Asiatic inhabitants. The English form the ruling class. They are divided into castes almost as much as are the East Indians. At the head are the government officials, the swells of the town. They dress well and spend a great deal of time out of office hours playing tennis and golf, which have already been introduced into this part of the Black Continent. They also ride about on horseback and in carriages, and manage to make a good show upon very low salaries. Allied to them are the sportsmen and the noble visitors from abroad. A scattering element of dukes, lords, and second sons of noble families has come out to invest or to hunt big game. They are usually men of means, for the prices of large tracts of land are high and it also costs considerable money to fit out a game shooting expedition. In addition, there are land speculators who are chiefly young men from England or South Africa. Dressed in riding clothes, big helmet hats, and top boots, they dash about the country on ponies and are especially in evidence around the bars of the hotels. There are but few white women here. Some of the government officials have their wives with them, and now and then a titled lady comes out to hunt with her friends. I met 3 women who had themselves shot lions. Nairobi has English doctors, dentists, and lawyers. It has 1 photographer and 2 firms which advertise themselves as safari outfitters. These men supply sportsmen with tents, provisions, and other things for shooting trips, as well as porters to carry their stuff and chase the lions out of the jungles so that the hunters may get a shot at them. It seems strange to have newspapers under the shadow of Mount Kenya, and within a half-day's ride on horseback to lion and rhinoceros hunting. Nevertheless, Nairobi has 3 dailies, which also issue weekly editions. They are all banking on the future of the town and all claim to be prosperous. They are good-sized journals, selling for from 2 to 3 annas, or from 4 to 6 cents each. They have regular cable dispatches giving the big news of the world, and they furnish full reports of the local cricket, polo, tennis, and golf matches. As for the advertisements, most of them come from the local merchants, and some are odd to an extreme. One of today's papers carries an advertisement signed by a well-known American circus company, which wants to buy a white rhinoceros, a giant hog, some wild dogs, a wild-tailed mongoose, and a bongo. Another advertisement, one made along farming lines, is that of the Homestead Dairy, and others state that certain merchants will outfit hunters for shooting. There are many land sales advertised, as well as machinery, American wagons, and all sorts of agricultural implements. Nairobi has several hotels, the accommodations in which are comfortable. I am stopping at the Norfolk at the upper end of the town. It is a low 1-story building with a wide porch in front, separated from the dirt street by a picket fence, and shaded by eucalyptus trees through which the wind seems to be ever sighing and moaning. The charges are $3.33 a day, including meals, but I have to have my own servant to make my bed and run my errands. I have a room at the back with a fine view of the stable. A German sportsman next door has a little cub lion, about as big as a Newfoundland dog, tied in a box outside his window. During a part of the day he lets the baby lion out and ties him by a rope to one of the pillars of the porch. The animal seems harmless, but its teeth are sharp, and it is entirely too playful to suit me. Besides, it roars at night. The horses are fairly good here, but the charges for them are steep. When I ride out on horseback, it costs me $1.65 an hour, and the carriage rates are still higher. The best way to get about is in the jinrikishas, using the natives as beasts of burden, but for a long ride over the plains, horses are necessary. The heavy hauling of this part of East Africa is done mostly by the sacred cattle of India. I mean the clean-cut animals with great humps on their backs. They are fine looking and are apparently well bred. Some of these beasts are hitched to American wagons brought out here from Wisconsin. I saw such a team hauling a Kentucky plow through the streets of Nairobi yesterday. Indeed, I find that American goods are slowly making their way into these wilds. American axes and sewing machines and American sowers and planters are sold by the East Indians. The drug stores carry our patent medicines, and every market has more or less American cottons. The woodcutters are using American axes, but they complain of the flat or oval holes made for the handles. They say that a round hole would be better, as the natives who do the wood cutting are very clumsy and the handles snap off at the axe. If round holes were used, heavier handles could be put in and the Negroes could make them themselves. Nairobi promises to become one of the railroad centers of this part of the world. It is the chief station between the Indian Ocean and Lake Victoria, and a road is now proposed from here to Mount Kenya. The Uganda Railway goes through some of the poorest country in the colony, and the Mount Kenya road will open up a rich agricultural region which is thickly populated by tribes more than ordinarily industrious. The railroad shops are here, and the employees have a large collection of tin cottages for their homes. The headquarters of the railroad, where the chief officers stay, are one-story tin buildings. The telegraphic offices are connected with them. Both railroad and telegraph are run by the government. The telegraphic rates are comparatively low. Far off here in the jungles of Africa, one can send messages much more cheaply than in the United States. A message of 8 words from here to Uganda costs 33 cents, and one can telegraph to London about as cheaply as from New York to San Francisco. This is so notwithstanding the difficulty which the linemen have to keep up the wires which the jewelry-loving natives steal. During the Nandi rebellion 40-odd miles of it were carried away and never recovered, and in one of the provinces adjoining Uganda, above Lake Victoria, the natives are so crazy after the copper wire there used that it is almost impossible to keep the lines in shape. Another serious danger to the telegraph is the big game. The giraffes reach up and play with the brackets and pull the wire this way and that. At Naivasha, the hippopotami have once or twice butted down the poles, and I hear they have been doing considerable damage to the lines along the coast near the Tana River. In the heart of Uganda, the monkeys have a way of swinging on the wires and twisting them together, which stops the transmission of messages so that the way of the linemen is indeed hard. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Cairo to Kisumu by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. John Bull in East Africa. I've just had a long talk with Mr. Frederick J. Jackson, the acting governor and commander-in-chief of this big territory which John Bull owns in the heart of East Africa. Mr. Jackson came out here to hunt big game years ago, and he has been on the ground from that time to this. He has long been employed by the British government in the administration of Uganda and of the Protectorate of East Africa, and he is now lieutenant governor in the absence of Colonel Sadler, the acting governor of the country. Let me give you some idea of this vast region which the British are opening up in the midst of the Black Continent. This country altogether is larger than the combined states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. It has a population of 4 million natives, most of whom not so long ago were warring with one another. Some of the tribes made their living by preying upon their neighbors. Slavery was everywhere common, and one of the great slave routes to the coast was not far from the line where the Uganda Railway now runs. Today all these evils have been done away with. The warlike tribes have been conquered and are turning their attention to stock raising and farming. Slavery has been practically abolished and peace prevails everywhere. The whole country is now kept in good order by only about 1,800 police and less than 2,000 English and East Indian soldiers. A large part of the region along the line of the railroad has been divided into ranches and farms. Small towns are springing up here and there, and in time the greater part of the plateau will be settled. There is no doubt that white men can live here. The children I see are rosy with health, and the farmers claim that with care they are as well as they were when back home in England. There are some Europeans here who have had their homes on the highlands for over 12 years, and they report that the climate is healthful and invigorating. They are able to work out of doors from 6 until 10 o'clock in the morning and from 3 to 6 o'clock in the afternoon, and during a part of the year all the day through. As a rule, however, the sun is so hot at midday that one should not go out unless his head is well protected. The heat here is dry. The nights are usually so cool that a blanket is needed. Notwithstanding the fact that we are almost on the equator, at any latitude above 8,000 feet ice may be found in the early morning. Nearer the coast the land drops and the climate is tropical. For 200 miles back from the Indian Ocean, there are practically no white settlers, except at Mombasa, for it is only on this high plateau that they are as yet attempting to live. But let me continue my description in the words of the man who governs the country. My conversation took place in a long, blue, iron-roofed building known as the Commissioner's Office, situated on the hill above Nairobi. I had asked as to the colony's future. Mr. Jackson replied, "It is all problematical. We have an enormous territory and millions of people. We have not yet prospected the country, nor have we dealt long enough with the natives to know what we can do with the people. We have really no ideas yet as to just what our resources are, or the labor we can secure to exploit them." "How many inhabitants have you?" "We do not know. We can get some idea from the taxes, for most of the provinces have to pay so much per hut. In other places the natives have hardly been subdued, and of no province have we an accurate census. The number has been estimated at from 2 to 4 millions, but I believe it is nearer 5 millions and possibly more." "How about your white settlers? Will this country ever be inhabited by Caucasians?" "That again is difficult to say," replied the conservative governor. "We have a few European settlers already, but whether we can make this colony a second South Africa remains to be seen. I have lived here for over 20 years, and I am not sure as to how much hard manual labor any white man can do in this latitude. It is true we are more than a mile above the sea, but nevertheless we are on the equator, and the climate on the equator is not suited to the white man. The only Europeans who will succeed here will be those who bring some money with them and who will use the native labor in their work. I don't think any settler should come to East Africa without as much as $3,000, reckoning the amount in your money. He should have enough to buy his land, stock it, build his house, and then have something to go on. He should not start out with a very small tract. Much of the grazing land is now being divided up into tracts of 5,000 acres. If a man takes the first 1,000 and pays for it, the other 4,000 are held for him, subject to certain improvements and developments upon the first 1,000. After these are completed, he may buy the remaining tract at the price of the first 1,000 acres. I understand much of your land is being taken up in large holdings." "That is so to a certain extent," replied Mr. Jackson, "but we are now discouraging such allotments, and would rather have the land apportioned in tracts of from 640 acres to about 5,000 acres each. If the land is for grazing, the larger area is desirable. If it is for grain farming or dairying, it is better that it should be small. As to our large landholders, the British East African Company owns about 500 square miles. Lord Delamere has about 100,000 acres, and Lord Hindlip a little less. There are a number of settlers who have 20,000 acres or more." "How about your ranching possibilities? I understand that your stock growers expect to found a great meat industry here which will crowd our Chicago packers out of the markets of England." "I do not think there is room for alarm about that matter as yet," replied the official. "This country is just in the making, and we know practically nothing about it. We realize that we have some of the richest grasses of the world, grasses which have supported vast herds of game and upon which cattle, sheep, goats, and hogs will thrive. But we do not know whether we can conquer the diseases and insect pests which attack all the animals we have so far imported. We seem to have every disease to which cows, horses, or sheep are subject in other parts of the world, and I believe we have some peculiarly our own. We have ticks by the millions and flies by the myriads. So far, however, our experiments with cattle are turning out well, and we know that we can produce excellent beef and good butter. We hope to find our first market for our meats and dairy products in South Africa, and later on to ship such things to Europe. The creation of an industry of that kind, though, is a matter of gradual development. We shall have to arrange about proper transportation, which means cold storage cars and cold storage ships. We have not gone far enough as yet to be able to predict what we can do." "What other possibilities have you?" I asked. I think we may be eventually able to raise coffee, and we are already exploiting certain fibers which grow well between here and the coast. The plant which produces the sansevieria fiber is indigenous to this country and is being exploited by Americans who are working not far from the station of Voi, about 100 miles from the Indian Ocean. I have no doubt we can raise sisal hemp and know that we can grow rami without cultivation. As to minerals, a great deal of prospecting has already been done, but the results have not been satisfactory. We know that we have gold, silver, and copper, but the deposits so far discovered have not been valuable enough to pay for their mining. This whole country is volcanic. We lie here in a basin surrounded by volcanoes. We have Mount Kenya on the north, Kilimanjaro on the south, and Mount Elgon away off to the northwest. The eruptions of these mountains have been so comparatively recent that some believe that they have buried the precious metals so deep down in the earth that we shall never get at them. How about your timber? We have fine forests containing both hard and soft woods, among them a great deal of cedar, such as is used for making cigar boxes and lead pencils. Most of such wood, however, is inland and at long distance from streams upon which it could be floated down to the sea. At present our timber resources are practically inaccessible by railroad. Speaking of the possibilities of this East African colony, it may be one of the coffee lands of the future. Several plantations which have been set out not far from here are doing well. There is one coffee estate within 5 miles of Nairobi, which belongs to the Catholic Mission of the Holy Ghost. Yesterday I rode out on horseback over the prairie to have a look at it. The way to the estate is through fenced fields, which are spotted here and there with the sheet iron cottages of English settlers. As I rode on, I saw many humped cattle grazing in the pastures. The grass is everywhere tall and thick, and the red soil, although not much cultivated as yet, seems rich. Arriving at the plantation, I was met by Father Tom Burke, and walked with him through his coffee plantation. It covers something like 15 acres and has now more than 8,000 trees in full bearing. The yield is so good that the plantation is supplying not only the town of Nairobi with all the coffee it needs, but is shipping several tons every year to Europe. Father Burke tells me that the coffee trees begin to bear at a year and a half, and that they are in full bearing within about 4 years. As the ripening season is long, the berries have to be picked many times. I saw blossoms and green and ripe berries on the same tree. In one place the natives were picking, at another they were hoeing the plants, while in a third place they were pulping the berries in a pulper turned by hand. The trees seem thrifty. Father Burke says that the young plants grow easily, and that where the birds carry the berries away and drop the seeds, the plants will sprout up of themselves. There is a plantation nearby of 30,000 trees, and I am told that there is a fair prospect of a considerable coffee industry springing up. I saw many negroes at work in the fields. They were Kikuyus, and were really fine looking fellows. They were clearing up new ground, chopping down the weeds with mattocks, and digging up the soil and turning it over. The sweat stood in beads upon their brows and backs and ran down their bare legs. I asked the priest what wages they got, and was told that they each received the equivalent of about 5 cents for a day of 10 hours. I suggested to the Reverend Father that the pay was small, but he said that the natives could not earn more than that sum, and even at those wages it was difficult to keep them at work. I hear the same statement made everywhere. The English people here think that the native Africans are well enough paid at the rate of a half cent per hour, or of a rupee per month. If you protest, they will say that the sum is sufficient to supply all the wants of a black man, and ask why he should be paid more. Think of it, ye American toilers who belong to our labor unions. Think of 5 cents a day for carrying bricks or stone, for chopping up ground under the eyes of a taskmaster, or for trotting along through the grass hour after hour with a load of 60 pounds on your head. Think of it, and you may get an idea of how the English white man here is carrying the black man's burden. Indeed, as the Frenchman says, it is to laugh. End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Cairo to Kisumu by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. With the Big Game Hunters. Kenya Colony is in the land of big game, and Nairobi is the chief place where parties are fitted out for hunting. As I write this chapter, several large parties are here preparing to go out on safari, as such hunts are called. The Norfolk Hotel is filled with hunters, and behind it are scores of black, half-naked porters and tent boys, packing sporting goods into boxes, laying in provisions, and arranging things for the march. There are headmen rounding up the porters and giving each his load. There are gun bearers seeing to the arms and ammunition, and there are the sportsmen themselves, some clad all in khaki, some wearing riding breeches and leggings, and all in thick helmets. First in the normal personnel of a safari comes the headman, who is supposed to be in full charge, except for the gun bearers and tent boy, who are personal servants and under the immediate direction of their masters. The askaris are armed soldiers to guard the camp at night and look after the porters on the route. There is one askari to every 10 or 20 porters. The cook has a staff of assistants. Each sportsman's tent boy must look after his tent and clothing and serve him at meals. The sisas, or pony boys, look after the horses and equipment. In the big yard upon which my hotel rooms look, I can see piles of tusks, heads, horns, and skins brought in by parties which have just returned. And in one corner is the baby lion whose roars have pestered my sleep. Among the hunters are several eminent and titled Englishmen and women, some of the latter having come out to try to shoot at a lion or so. During this last year 2 women have shot lions here, and one of the biggest man-eaters ever killed in East Africa came down through a bullet from a gun in the hands of an American girl. There is so much game that almost anyone who goes out can bring back something. Last year's bag, numbering many thousand head, was shot by sportsmen from England, France, Germany, Austria, Italy, India, Australia, North America, and New Zealand. We have all read the stories of Theodore Roosevelt, who shot lions and elephants here and in Uganda, and we know that British East Africa has supplied the Chicago Museum and the National Museum at Washington with some of their finest zoological specimens. The hunting laws here are rigid. No one can shoot without a license, and the man who kills young elephants, cow elephants, or baby giraffes will pay a big fine and spend a long term in jail. Shooting big game is regulated by license. The sportsman's license, with certain restrictions, gives the right to shoot or capture 2 bull buffaloes, 4 lions, 1 rhinoceros, 2 hippopotami, 10 colobi monkeys, 4 marabou, and a limited and specified number of other game, such as antelope, bongos, reed bucks, and cheetahs. A special license costing 150 rupees, about $50, is required for 1 elephant, while the privilege of killing 2 elephants costs 3 times as much. Only 2 elephants are allowed every year. It costs $50 to get a permit to kill or capture a giraffe, and the hunter is allowed only 1 a year. A traveler's license, available for a month, costs $5 and gives the right to kill or capture 4 zebra and not over 5 antelopes out of 8 named varieties. Animals killed on private land on either the traveler's or sportsman's license do not count in the total authorized. A register must be kept of all kills or captures under license. As for leopards and crocodiles, no permit is required to shoot them. There is such a great variety of game that there is no need of chasing over the swamps or tramping about over the plains for days before one gets a shot. One sees a dozen different kinds of beasts on the plains at the same time and can change his sport from day to day. The sportsman will find antelopes almost everywhere and will not infrequently be in sight of an ostrich or so. These birds are big game and are hunted largely on ponies. They are very speedy, and, however it may be elsewhere, Here they do not poke their heads down in the sand and wait for the hunter to come. On the other hand, they spread out their wings and go off on the trot, swimming, as it were, over the ground. They can run faster than a horse, but they actually run in large circles, and the hunters catch them by cutting across the arcs of the circles or running around in smaller circles inside. It is a great thing here to shoot a cock ostrich in order that you may give your sweetheart or wife the beautiful white feathers from his wings. And then there is the zebra. His black and white stripes shine out so plainly in the brilliant sun that he is to be seen by the thousand on the Athi plains, and not far from the railroad all the way from Voi to Uganda, a distance greater than from New York to Pittsburgh. Had it not been against the law, I could have picked off some with my revolver as I rode through on the cars. The zebra is rather shyer when found far from the railroad, but on the whole he is easy to kill. Away from the game reservations on the railroad he will run like a deer, and as zebras usually go in droves, the excitement of following them over the plain is intense. Zebra skins tanned with the hair are fine trophies, and I am told that zebra steak is excellent eating. The flesh tastes like beef with a gamier flavor. The animals are so beautiful, however, and so much like horses that only a brute would kill them for sport. In hunting elephants many a sportsman makes enough to pay a good share of his African expenses. He can shoot only 2 bull elephants, but if he gets good ones, their 4 tusks may bring him $1,500 or $2,000. The African elephants have the largest tusks of their kind. I have seen some which weighed 150 pounds each, and tusks have been taken which weigh up to 200 pounds. African ivory is the best and fetches the highest prices. It is difficult to get the tusks out. The porters may be half a day chopping away the meat, and it will take about 4 men to carry a tusk of the size I have mentioned. There are men here who hunt elephants for their ivory, but most of the licenses are issued to sportsmen who care more for the honor of having made a good shot than anything else. One of the best places to shoot an elephant is through the eye or halfway between the ear and the eye. Another good shot is just back of the flap of the ear, and a third is in a place on one side of the tail, so that the ball will run along the spine and enter the lungs. Large bullets and heavy guns are used. When the animal is close, it is exceedingly dangerous to shoot and not kill. When injured, the elephant is very revengeful. He will throw his trunk into the air, scream, hiss, and snort and rush after the hunter, knocking him down with a blow of his trunk and charging upon him with his great tusks. If the man falls, the huge beast is liable to kneel upon him and mash him to a jelly. One of the difficulties of hunting elephants is the fact that it is not easy to distinguish them in the woods, as they are of much the same color as the trees. A traveler here tells me that he once almost walked into a big elephant while going through the forest. He was stooping down and looking straight before him when he saw the beast's legs and took them for tree trunks. The average elephants of this region can easily make 6 miles an hour while on the march. They usually travel in herds, young and old moving along together. Notwithstanding their enormous weight, the animals can swim well and can cross the largest rivers without any trouble. Most of those which used to overrun these plains have been driven away and must now be hunted in the woods. But there are plenty in the forest between here and Uganda, and about the slopes of Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro. There are also many in the south near the Zambezi and west of Lake Tanganyika in the forests along the Congo. Some years ago they were being killed off at such a rapid rate, and the ivory output was decreasing so fast that strict rules for their preservation were inaugurated and are being enforced. As for hippos and rhinos, there are plenty of them still left along the streams and about the Great Lakes of the tropical parts of the continent. There are rhinoceroses almost everywhere in the woods between Nairobi and Uganda. I have seen a number of hippos, and were I a hunter, which I am not, I could, I venture to say, bag enough of their hides to make riding whips for all the hunt clubs of Virginia. The settlers tell me the animals come in and root up their gardens, and that it is almost impossible to fence against them. Both rhinos and hippos are hard to kill. Each has a skin about half an inch thick, and there are only a few places upon them where a ball will go through. Hippos can be hunted in boats on the lakes, but they swim rapidly and dive deep, remaining under the surface a long time. They move along through the water, showing only their ears and nose. They are so wary that it is difficult to get a shot at just the right place. One of the best points at which to aim is under the eye or back of the head between the ears. These animals are sometimes harpooned, but such hunting is dangerous, as they are liable to crush one's boat. The rhinos also have to be approached very carefully. They have a keen sense of smell, although they cannot see to any great distance, and their hearing is not good. They are usually hunted on foot, and one must be careful to get on the windward side of them. A rhinoceros does not hesitate to charge an enemy. He uses the great horn on his nose, which is a terrible weapon, and enables him to kill a horse at one blow. Most of these beasts are black, but now and then a white one is found. I met a man the other day who claimed to have killed a white rhinoceros. Since I have been in Africa, I have received a number of letters from American sportsmen asking the cost of shooting big game in this part of the world. The question is hard to answer. It depends on the man and to some extent on the bargains he makes. There are business firms in Nairobi and in Mombasa which specialize in outfitting hunting parties, making all arrangements for guides, food, and porters, somewhat as Cook does for tourists. The prices in such cases depend upon the length and character of the tour and the size of the party. There is a young American here now whose mother calls him Dodo, who paid $500 for a 3 days' hunt after leopards, and this did not necessitate a permit, as they are on the free list. The young man tramped about with his porters through the tall grass, and was given a shot or so at 2 leopards, both of which he missed. Had he tried for big game, it would have cost him at the least $250 more. On a long hunt, the expenses of all kinds can be considerably reduced, and I should think that $40 a day for each sportsman in the party would be a fair estimate. I am told that a man can be fitted out with porters, gun bearers, and personal servants for $250 a month. One can get a good cook for from $5 to $8 a month, a gun bearer for about $10, and a personal servant for from $8 to $10. The question of provisions for the trip depends much upon the tastes of the individual sportsman. There are native villages almost everywhere at which some fresh food can be bought at cheap rates. Chickens are plentiful at 8 cents a pound, and meats cost the same. In the streams and lakes there are fish. The guns of the party ought to supply plenty of game, and one need never suffer for the want of antelope or zebra steak. Other food should be packed up in boxes of 60 pounds each, and in case the outfit is prepared at Nairobi, each box will have sufficient for one man's requirements for 1 week. Most of the stuff is in tins and usually includes plenty of Chicago canned beef, Canadian bacon, and London biscuits, jams, and marmalades. Such boxes are labeled with numbers, number 1 containing the first week's supply, number 2 the second week's, and so on. Each box weighs just 60 pounds, as no more than that can be carried on the head of one porter. I would advise the American sportsman who intends coming out here to shoot to stop off on the way in England for most of his supplies. Several London firms make a specialty of outfitting for African travel and for hunting expeditions. One should have double roof tents, the square tents being the best. It will be well to bring a mackintosh or rubber blanket 1 foot wider all around than the floor of the tent, for many of the camps may be soggy and marshy. One should also have a folding bedstead, a cork bed, and warm blankets. A folding chair and table will not be found amiss. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Cairo to Kisumu by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Among the Kikuyus and the Nandi. Shortly after leaving Nairobi by train for Lake Victoria, I came into the land of the Kikuyus, where I stopped off for a while. Over a million of these native people live in the country about 2,000 feet above Nairobi. We could see their farms and villages everywhere as we rode by on the railroad. In clearing the land, they first burn off the trees and other vegetation, then work the ground until it is barren. After that, they clear more land, letting the first tracts lie fallow until nature revives them. Some of the Kikuyu farms are no bigger than a bed quilt, others cover a quarter of an acre, and some twice as much. The fields are not fenced, and now and then a rhino or hippo gets in and wallows, while near the woodlands the monkeys pull up the crops. The chief thing raised is Indian corn. The dress of the Kikuyus consists mostly of grease, clay, and telegraph wire. The grease makes their brown skins shine, the red clay gives it a copper hue, and the telegraph wire loads their arms, necks, and ankles. The grease is usually mutton fat, and the clay is the red earth found everywhere. The more rancid the fat, the better they seem to like it. The average man or woman so smells to heaven that one can distinguish a native's existence long before he sees him. They soak their hair with this tallow until, under the tropical sun, you can almost hear the stuff sizzle. They stiffen their hair with clay so that it can be put up in all sorts of shapes. I examined one man's head the other day. It was a pale brick rust color and covered with something like 10,000 individual curls, which stood out over his pate like the snakes of the Medusa. Each curl was an inch long and had been twisted by a professional hairdresser. This man had 6 long pipe stems in his ears. Each was about as big around as a lead pencil and about the same length, and was fastened through a hole made in the rim of the ear by a kind of brass button. These stems standing out at the sides of his head looked almost like horns, save that they projected from the ears. He had beads in the lobes. One of the men with him had the lobe of his ear so stretched that it held a plug as big as an apple. I bought the plug of him for 3 cents, and the man then took the 2 lobes of his ears and joined them together under his chin, tying them there with a bit of fiber in order that they might not catch on a branch as he went through the forest. Kikuyus live in small villages that look like collections of haycocks until one comes close to them. When one gets inside, he finds they contain as many animals as men. The houses are thatched huts built about 6 feet apart in circles around an enclosure in which the cattle, sheep, and goats are kept at night. The sheep and goats often get inside the huts. Each circle of houses usually belongs to one family, a chief and his relatives thus living together. The huts have wooden walls about 4 feet high with conical roofs. The boards, which are about 18 inches or 2 feet wide, are chopped out of the trees with native axes. A native and his wives will require about 10 days to build a shelter. The wood used is soft, and the kind is regulated by the government, which charges 66 cents for enough lumber to build one shack. Besides its huts, each family has 2 or 3 granaries for its supply of Indian corn. These are made with thatched roofs, wicker walls, and wicker floors, and are raised a foot or 18 inches off the ground. They are usually about as big around as a hogshead and 6 feet high. The Kikuyus are practically vegetarians. They live on corn, beans, sweet potatoes, and a kind of millet. They have a few cattle and some sheep, but they consider them too valuable to be slaughtered and only eat them when the cattle are sick or become injured in some way and have to be killed. They have no chickens and eat neither fowls nor eggs. This is because in the past the crowing of cocks would give away the locality of a village, thereby bringing down its enemies and the slave traders upon it. These people have many dishes like ours. They eat roasting ears off the cob, and they boil beans and corn together to make a kind of succotash. They have also a gruel made of millet and milk, and if one of the family becomes sick, he is sometimes given mutton broth. In their cooking they use clay jars, which they rest upon stones above fires built on the ground. They use gourds for carrying milk and water, and bags of woven bark ranging in size from a pint to 4 bushels are used for all sorts of purposes. The larger ones serve for the transportation of the grain to the markets. The Kikuyu look upon the females of his family as so much available capital. If a man has 15 or 20 wives, he is supposed to be rich beyond the dreams of avarice. I hear that many of the chiefs have a dozen or more, and that since the British have begun to exploit the forests, the more industrious of the native men have been rapidly increasing their families. A good girl, large and healthy, will bring as much as 50 sheep. A maiden is supposed to be ready for sale at 12 years, and $20 in cattle or sheep is an average price. For this sum the woman should be large, well formed, and fairly good looking. Homely or lean girls go cheap and often remain single, in which case they have to work for their parents. A man may pay down 10 sheep and agree to bring in the balance from month to month as he and his wives earn the money for them. He goes into the woods and cuts down trees, being paid so much per stick. If he works hard, he may make $3 or $4 a month, and if, in addition, he has several women to help him, his income may be doubled or trebled. In such work the men cut the wood and the women carry it on their backs to the market. They are loaded up by their husbands, a piece of goat skin separating the rough sticks from the woman's bare skin, and the burden being tied on by a rope of vines which rests on the forehead. In addition to this goat skin on her back, the woman usually has an apron or skirt of skin tied about the waist and reaching to the knees and sometimes below them. A strong, lusty girl can carry as much as 200 pounds of wood in this way, and her husband does not scruple to pile on all she can take. In coming from the plains over the mountains into the Great Rift Valley, I rode for miles through the woods and had a chance to see what the British government is doing to save the forests. The wooded area of Kenya extends over 3,200 square miles, of which the tropical forest covers about 183 square miles, the remainder being upland or highland containing valuable trees. Transportation facilities are so limited, however, and much of the country is so little known, that the British have only made a good beginning in exploiting the timber resources and in scientific forestry work. Lumber is high. Leaving the Kikuyu hills, one finds that there are woods all the way to the ridge known as the escarpment, and that they extend for some distance down the sides of the Rift Valley. Here in the valley itself, the country is mostly pasture, and there is no timber of any account. In the forest region above referred to the woods are thin, and in many places the original growth has been cleared by the Kikuyus. The government is now prohibiting their practice of burning the wood and doing all it can to save the trees remaining and to build up new woodlands. I met at Naivasha an Australian, one of the heads of the forestry department, who told me that the government had nurseries at Mombasa, Nairobi, Escarpment, and Nandi. Near Mombasa they are setting out teak trees, while at Nairobi they have planted a large number of acacia and eucalyptus trees imported from Australia. The eucalyptus grows well at Nairobi. I saw trees that are 75 feet high, although they are only 5 years old. The forest manager told me he was laboring under the greatest of disadvantages in his efforts to raise new trees. He said he had to fight not only the natives, but also the monkeys, baboons, and other wild animals. The woods are full of monkeys, among them a dog-faced baboon which grows as big as a 10-year-old boy. This creature barks like a dog and acts like a devil. It watches the planting, then sneaks in at night and digs up the trees. If seeds are put in, it digs them up and bites them in two, and if the trees should sprout, it pulls the sprouts out of the ground and breaks them up and throws them away. As a result, the nurseries have to be watched all the time by men with guns in their hands. If the men have no guns, the baboons will jump for the nearest tree and grin from the branches, only to return to their devastating work as soon as the watchmen go away. If guns are brought out, the animals realize their danger and run for their lives. These monkeys also dig up the Indian corn planted by the Kikuyus and are said to be far worse than crows and blackbirds combined. At one of the stations between Naivasha and the escarpment, I saw a half-dozen Nandi, including 2 women. The men were almost naked, save that they wore cloaks of monkey skins with the fur on and strips of cowskin about the waist. The women had on waistcloths and blankets of cowhides tanned with the hair on. These blankets were fastened over one shoulder, leaving the arms and half of the breasts bare. The Nandi were walking along the railroad track and were closely watched by the station agents, for they are great thieves, and the British have had trouble with them because they steal the bolts and rivets which hold the rails to the ties, and even climb the telegraph poles after the wire. The native men are crazy for iron. They can use the bolts and rivets for slingshots to brain their enemies. All the iron they have had in the past has come from digging up the ore and smelting it, so you can imagine how delightful it is to a Nandi warrior to pick up a fine, death-dealing iron bolt all ready for his sling. The Nandi live northwest of Naivasha on a plateau which contains iron deposits, and they make a business of mining and smelting. Since the railroad has been built, they have come down from time to time and raided the tracks, and the British have had several little fights with them to drive them off. These Nandi are among the bravest of the African natives. They are much like the Masai, delighting in warfare and ready to fight at the least provocation. They are more civilized than the Kikuyus and do considerable work in iron and leather. They have cattle, sheep, and goats, while a few do some farming. Like the Masai, they bleed their cattle and drink the blood hot, sometimes mixing it with their porridge. After bleeding, they close the wounds so that the cattle grow well again. They are good hunters and have large dogs with which they run down the game so that it can be killed with spears. They also trap game by digging wedge-shaped pits and covering them with grass. They have donkeys to carry the iron ore from the mines to their furnaces, where they turn it into pig metal. I understand that the Nandi live about the same as the other natives about here. They have circular huts of boards roofed with thatch. Each hut has a fireplace in the center, on each side of which is a little bed consisting of a platform of mud built along the wall of the hut. The people sleep on the mud, using round blocks of wood for pillows. The children sleep with their parents until they are 6 years of age, when they are shoved off into a smaller hut outside built especially for them. The Nandi believe in witches and medicine men, and have a sky god to whom they pray every morning and to whom they sacrifice when times are hard. Nearly all of these Africans believe in witch doctors. The Wakamba, whose country I passed through on my way to Nairobi, not infrequently kill the women of their tribe when they are charged with witchcraft, and there is a record of something like 40 having been murdered this way within the last few years. I saw these Wakamba on the Athi Plains and in and about Nairobi. They are tall and fine-looking, with woolly hair, rather thick lips, and almost straight noses. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Cairo to Kisumu by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Great Rift Valley and the Masai. In the heart of the East African highlands, as far south of the Mediterranean Sea as New York is distant from Denver, and as far west of the Indian Ocean as Pittsburgh is west of the Atlantic, I am writing this chapter. Lake Naivasha, which is spread out before me, is in the Great Rift Valley, a mighty trough that runs almost north and south through this part of the continent. This great rift begins, it is now believed, south of the Zambezi and embraces Lake Rudolph on the north. Traces of it are to be found even in Palestine. It is supposed to have been formed by the earth's folding up after a stupendous volcanic eruption, which left the craters of Kilimanjaro, Kenya, and Elgon touching the clouds at altitudes of from 14,000 to nearly 20,000 feet. The valley was named by Professor J. W. Gregory, the famous British geologist, who came out to East Africa in order to explore its system of valleys and to discover their origin. For many months he disappeared. There were rumors that he had been killed and cut to pieces by the Masai. But one day he turned up, looking ill and worn but triumphant. The results of his trip were published in a book now historical, The Great Rift Valley, from which this huge trough got its name. Today, one sees everywhere in this part of the country notices of Rift Valley farms or Rift Valley hotels. It is still an objective of scientific explorations and the subject of scientific discussions. This mighty valley narrows and widens, it rises and falls, and it has many big lakes. Broadly speaking, all the great lakes of East Africa are in it or in its spurs. North of here are Lakes Baringo and Rudolph, and still farther north in Abyssinia is Lake Tsana, the source of the Blue Nile. As I write, I am looking out on Lake Naivasha, a beautiful sheet of blue water over which white cranes are flying. I can see zebras and buck feeding not far from the water, and with my glass can watch the ugly black heads of 3 hippopotami bobbing up and down like giant fishing corks upon the surface. The swampy shores are lined with masses of reeds. Just back of them the ground rises into rich pastures which are protected from sportsmen by the reservations allotted to the Uganda Railway, and which fairly swarm with big game. The weather here is delightful. We are so near the equator that we can almost straddle it, but the altitude is such that blankets are needed at night, and it is never excessively hot during the day. Naivasha is a little higher up in the air than the top of Mount Washington. Indeed, the climate of the whole Rift Valley is said to be suited to white men. This matter is being tested by settlers, for large tracts of land have been taken up in different places not far from the railroad, and there are many Englishmen who are going into stock raising. Near the lake at Morandat, the government of Kenya Colony has started an experiment farm, and there are big ranches in the immediate vicinity. There are no tsetse flies here, for even in the tropics the tsetse is seldom found at an altitude over 4,000 feet. The zebras, which one sees by the hundreds in almost any ride over the valley, are evidences that horses will thrive. There are also many ostriches, and in time we may have ostrich farming here as in South Africa. The average elevation of the lake valley is something like 6,000 feet, and the grass is said to be luxuriant everywhere. This is one of the strongholds of the Masai race, who have always been noted as warriors and stock raisers. I see them about Naivasha, and not a few still carry spears and shields. They have many little towns nearby, and their settlements are scattered throughout the Rift Valley. They live in huts about 4 feet high, 6 feet wide, and 9 feet long. The huts, which look like great bake ovens, are made of branches woven together and plastered with mud. Sometimes they are smeared over with cow dung, which material often forms the floors. When it rains, skins are laid over the roofs to protect them. The houses are usually built in a circle about an enclosure, in which the cattle are kept at night. The sheep and goats are allowed to run in and out of the huts. Some of the towns have fences of thorns around them to keep out the wild beasts. These Masai are a fierce-looking people. The men are tall and straight, and walk as though they owned the earth. When they have their war paint on, they use a decoration of ostrich feathers, which surrounds their faces and is supposed to carry terror to the souls of their enemies. These natives are by no means pure Negroes, but belong to the Hamitic Negroid or non-Bantu group. Their skins are dark brown, their noses are often straight, and their lips not very thick. I can't tell you whether their hair is woolly or not, for the women shave it close to the scalp, using razors of iron or glass, and polish their heads with grease so that they fairly shine in the sun. I understand they pull out the hair from all parts of their bodies, and that even the babies are shaved. Many of the men carry about tweezers of iron to pull the hairs from their chins, cheeks, and nostrils, and they keep themselves shaved until they are old enough to be warriors. This comes along about the time they reach manhood. They then let the hair of their heads grow and plait it into pigtails, which they frequently wear down over the forehead. The head, along with the rest of the body, is often anointed with oil and red clay. The warrior sometimes wears a lion's head and mane in addition to the circle of ostrich feathers about the face. His arms are a sword and a club. He has a spear with a very long blade and an oval shield bearing figures which indicate his clan. Like the Kikuyus and Nandi, these people buy their wives. Marriage, however, is not supposed to take place until the Masai becomes an elder, that is, until he reaches the age of about 27 or 30. This is after his fighting days are over and he is ready to settle down, as it were. The warriors and the young girls of the tribe live together up to that time in a separate establishment apart from the rest of the people. In order to marry, a warrior has to ask permission of the elders of the tribe. If this is given, he straightway buys his wife. If she is a good-looking girl, she will cost him 2 cows, 2 bullocks, 2 sheep, and some goatskins. This money goes to the nearest relative of the woman he has selected, who may lower the price if he will. Divorces may be had for laziness and bad temper on the part of the wife, and in such cases a part of the marriage fee is sometimes returned. A widow cannot marry again. If her husband dies, the relict goes back to her mother or to her brother if her mother be dead. As far as I can learn, these Masai girls have a soft snap. They are required to do nothing until they are married. Before that, they play with the warriors, spending their time in dancing and singing and loafing about. The unmarried girl often does not do her own cooking. This condition continues for a long time after marriage and up until all the babies of the family are fairly well grown. As soon as that is accomplished, however, the hard-working period begins. Almost all the hard labor of the tribe is done by the older women, who collect the firewood, build the mud houses, and gather the cow manure with which their walls are smeared. When the villages are moved from place to place, these withered dames take the parts of donkeys and bullocks in carrying the burdens and then erect the new huts. These Masai are a nation of stock raisers and own herds of cattle, sheep, and goats, which they drive about from pasture to pasture in the southern reservation, where the British government has put them. The cattle are of the humped variety, like the sacred cows of India, many of them being fat, sleek, and fine-looking. Some of the animals are branded, and not a few have rude bells of iron so they may be traced if they stray. Most of the cattle are watched by half-naked boys who drive them about with sticks. Morning and evening the cows are brought into the villages to be milked, and nearly every town of mud huts the women do the milking. This is contrary to the custom in some parts of Africa, where it is thought the cows will go dry if any female touches them. The milk is caught in gourds, which are afterward cleaned with handfuls of burnt grass. The people always drink their milk fresh, but their method of cleaning the gourds gives it a smoky flavor. If a calf dies, it is skinned and stuffed with straw and then placed under the cow's nose at milking time, for the natives say the cow will not let down her milk unless the calf is alongside. The Masai are blood drinkers. Their country has practically no salt, and I am told that they make up for this lack and keep healthy by blood drinking. The people eat but few vegetables and, strangely enough, do not kill or eat game. They do no farming whatever. Their cooking is usually done in pots of burnt clay varying from 8 to 20 inches in height. The larger pots are not placed over the fire, but at the side of it, and are turned around now and then in order that they may be evenly heated. Much of my information about the Masai comes from Captain Sidney L. Hind, who has had a long experience in Africa as an official, explorer, and lion hunter. He has written some books upon the Congo and other African countries and knows much concerning this part of the world. My talk with Captain Hind was at Mombasa, in a beautiful cottage overlooking the Indian Ocean. Upon the floor were skins of lions and leopards killed by Captain or Mrs. Hind, and on the walls were the heads of giraffes, antelopes, and gnus shot by her. The evolution of a British colony and how John Bull assumes the white man's burden can be read between the lines of my conversation with these people. Said Captain Hind: "When Mrs. Hind and I first came into the province, the country was in the same condition it had been in for ages. We found that it contained about 1,000,000 people who lived in little villages, each containing about 10 huts or so. There were no great chiefs. Each village was independent and almost constantly at war with the neighboring villages. The citizens of one settlement knew nothing of those of the other settlements about. A man dare not venture more than 10 miles from his home, and he had little knowledge of the country outside that radius. There were no roads whatever excepting trails which wound this way and that over the land. The only meeting places were at the markets, which were held at fixed points on certain days of the week or month. It is a rule throughout Africa that warfare and fighting must be suspended on market days, and no one dares bring arms to a market or fight there. If he should engage in fighting and be killed, his relatives cannot claim blood money. When we took possession of the Kenya province, we had to fight our way in. As soon as we had subdued the people, we made them work at making roads as a penalty for their insurrection. We connected all the villages by roadways and gave each town so much to take care of. As a result, we now have in that province alone several hundred miles of good wagon roads, each 10 feet wide. We have also made it the law that all roads shall be treated in one respect like a marketplace. This means that no native can assault another while walking over them, and that all feuds must be buried when traveling over the highways. Many of these roads connect villages which were formerly at war with each other, and the result of the law is that they have become peaceful and the citizens can now pass safely from one town to another. They are really changing their natures and are going through a process of travel education. As I have already said, 5 years ago they never left home. Now, thousands of them go over our thoroughfares down to the seacoast, and we have something like 1,800 natives of Kenya here at Mombasa. The British have found the Masai such good cattlemen that they believe they can train them into good grooms for horses. Another feature of British dealings with the natives is the establishment of trading posts in the native reserves. Here the Africans are encouraged to set up little stores of their own. It is hoped that this will develop wants and help civilize the more backward groups like the Masai until they become as enterprising as the Bagandas and Kavirandos. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of Cairo to Kisumu by Frank G. Carpenter. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Where the men go naked and the women wear tails. Unfurl your fans and take out your kerchiefs to hide your blushes. We are about to have a stroll among the Kavirondo, who inhabit the eastern shores of Lake Victoria on the western edge of Kenya Colony. These people are all more or less naked, and some of the sights we dare not describe. We have our cameras with us, but our Postmaster General would not allow some of our films to go through the mails, and no newspaper would publish certain pictures we take. We are in the heart of the continent, on the wide Gulf of Kavirondo, on the eastern shore of the second greatest freshwater lake of the world. That island-studded sea in front of us is Lake Victoria, and over there at the northwest, less than a week's march on foot and less than 2 days by the small steamers which ply on the lake, is Napoleon Gulf, out of which flows that great river, the Nile. With the glass one may see the hippopotami swimming near the shores of Kavirondo Bay, while behind us are plains covered with pastures and spotted with droves of cattle, antelope, and gnu, grazing not far from the queerly thatched huts of the stark naked natives. The plains have a sparse growth of tropical trees, and looking over them we can catch sight of the hills which steadily rise to the Mau escarpment of the great Rift Valley. Still farther east are the level highlands of the Kenya Colony, the whole extending on and on to Mombasa and the Indian Ocean, as far distant from Kisumu as Cleveland is from New York. I have been traveling for days in coming the 584 miles which lie between us and the ocean. Kisumu, formerly known as Port Florence, is the terminus of the Uganda Railway, the principal port of Lake Victoria and quite a commercial center. Steamers sail from Kisumu weekly to Uganda ports and back, and fortnightly round the lake by alternate routes, i.e. north and south. The trade is greatly increasing, and ivory, hides, grain, and rubber from Tanganyika Territory, the Upper Congo, and the lands to the north of the lake are shipped through here to the coast. The cars come right down to a wooden wharf which extends well out into the Kavirondo Gulf. On the lake are several small steamers brought up here in pieces and put together, which are now bringing in freight from all parts of this big inland sea. At the custom house inside an enclosure close to the wharf, the travelers had to pay a fee of 50 cents a package on all parcels except personal luggage. I was glad we got in before 6:30, the closing hour for all customs houses in Uganda ports, for after that, if I were carrying a parcel, I should have to slip 5 rupees to the official in charge. Kisumu is just a little tin town in the African wilds, yet there is a hotel where one can stay quite comfortably until he takes the steamer for the lake trip. There is an Indian bazaar near the station, but the post office, the few government buildings, and most of the residences are built on the hill to get the breeze from the lake. The Victoria Road and the Connaught Promenade are well laid out. Near the station there is a cotton ginnery where considerable quantities of cotton from Uganda are ginned and baled for export. A trail leads across country from Kisumu to Mumias, 48 miles away, and to Jinja, the source of the Nile. The European population consists of some soldiers belonging to the King's African Rifles, of the government officials, and of some employees of the railroad. The officials put on great airs. Among the passengers who came in with me yesterday was a judge who will settle the disputes among the natives. He was met at the cars by some soldiers and a gang of convicts in chains. The latter had come to carry his baggage and other belongings to his galvanized iron house on the hill, and each was dressed in a heavy iron collar, with iron chains extending from it to his wrists and ankles. Nevertheless, they were able to aid in lifting the boxes and in pushing them off on trucks, prodded to their work all the while by the guns of the soldiers on guard. But let us take our feet in our hands, as Uncle Remus says, and tramp about. Later on we may march off into the country through which I traveled for about 50 miles on my way here. In the town itself we may now and then see a man with a blanket wrapped around him, and the men frequently wear waistcloths behind or in front. Outside of the town they are stark naked. All have skins of a dark chocolate brown. They have rather intelligent faces, woolly hair, and lips and noses like those of a Negro. They belong to the Bantu family and are among the best formed of the peoples of Africa. Someone has said that traveling through their country is like walking through miles of living statuary. Take these Kavirondo men who have gathered about me just now as I write. Some of them look as though they might have been cut from black marble by a sculptor. Look at those 3 brown bucks at my left. They are as straight as Michelangelo's famed statue of David and about as well formed. See how firmly they stand on their black feet. Their heads are thrown back, and 2 have burst out laughing as I turn my camera toward them. With my eye I can follow the play of all their muscles as they slip beneath those smooth ebony skins. The Kavirondo seem the perfection of physical manhood. That nude fellow next to me has a coil of wire about his biceps and a pound of wire on his right wrist. He is smoking a pipe, but it just hangs between his teeth, which shine out, flashing white as he smiles. The man next to him has 2 brass rings on each of his black thumbs, bands of telegraph wire around his wrists, and 2 wide coils of wire above and below the biceps of his left arm. He has 5 wire bands about his neck, circles of wire under each knee, and great anklets of twisted wire on each of his feet. As I look, I can see the calloused places where the wire has worn into his instep. There are worse ones on that 3rd man whose ankles are loaded with twisted wire. The latter must have several pounds on each leg, and the wire on the right leg extends from the foot to the middle of the calf. Now look at their heads. The first man has short wool which hugs the scalp, and the other 2 have twisted their hair so that it hangs down about the head like Medusa's locks. Stopping for a moment, I ask the men to turn around so I may get a view from the rear. They are not quite so naked as I had supposed, for each has an apron of deerskin as big as a lady's pocket handkerchief fastened to his waistband behind. The aprons, tanned with the fur on, are tied to the belts with deerskin straps. As far as decency goes, they are of no value at all, and they seem to be used more for ornament than anything else. Let us train our cameras now on the women. They are by no means so fine looking as the men, being shorter and not so well formed. The younger girls are clad in bead waist belts, while the older ones have each a tassel of fiber tied to a girdle about the waist. This tassel is fastened just at the small of the back and hangs down behind. At a short distance it looks like a cow's tail. I am told that it is an indispensable article of dress for every married woman, and that it is improper for a stranger to touch it. Sir Harry Johnston, who once governed these people, says that even a husband dares not touch this caudal appendage worn by his wife, and if by mistake it is touched, a goat must be sacrificed or the woman will die from the insult. Some of the native women here in Kisumu wear little aprons of fiber about 6 inches long, extending down at the front. I can see dozens of them so clad all about me, and for a penny or so can get any of them to pose for my camera. The young girls have no clothes at all. This is the custom throughout the country. Indeed, farther back in the interior, the fringe aprons are removed, and both sexes are clad chiefly in wire jewelry of various kinds. The strangest thing about the nudity of these savages is that they are absolutely unconscious of any strangeness in it. Some of them, as have not met Europeans, do not know they are naked, and a married woman with her tail of palm fiber feels fully dressed. A traveler tells how he tried to introduce clothing to a gang of naked young women whom he met out in the country. He cut up some American sheeting and gave each girl a piece. They looked at the cloths with interest, but evidently did not know what to do with them. Thereupon the white man took a strip and tied it about the waist of one of the party. Upon this the other girls wrapped their pieces about their waists, but a moment later took them off, saying, "These are foreign customs and we do not want them." During my stay in the Kavirondo country, I have gone out among the villages and have seen the natives in their homes and at work. The land is thickly populated. The people are good natured, enterprising, and quiet. One can go anywhere without danger, and there is no difficulty in getting photographs of whatever one wants. I am surprised at the great number of married women. One knows their status from those sacred tales. The Kavirondo girls marry very early. They are often betrothed at the age of 6 years, but in such case the girl stays with her parents for 5 or 6 years afterward. The parents sell their girls for a price, a good wife being purchasable for 40 hoes, 20 goats, and a cow. In the case of an early betrothal, the suitor pays down part of the fixed sum and the rest in installments until all is paid. If the father refuses to give up the girl when the time comes for marriage, the payments having been made, the suitor organizes a band of his friends, captures her, and carries her home. A man usually takes his wife from a different village from that in which he lives. When he comes with his band to the bride's village, her gentlemen friends often resist the invasion and fight the suitor's party with sticks. At such times the girl screams, but I understand that she usually allows herself to be captured. I hear that old maids are not popular and that the average Kavirondo girl is just as anxious to be married as are our maidens at home. Indeed, she is usually so uneasy that if she does not get a bid in the ordinary way, she will pick out a man and arrange to have herself offered to him at a reduced rate. There are plenty of plump Kavirondo maidens now on the bargain counter. Another queer marriage custom here affects a man's sister-in-law. The man who gets the eldest girl in a family is supposed to have the refusal of all the younger ones as they come to marriageable age. The polygamous Kavirondo may thus have several sisters among his wives. One would suppose that these girls might be rather loose in their morals. On the contrary, I am told that they rank much better in this regard than the maidens of Uganda, in the province adjoining, nearly all of whom wear clothing. Virtue stands high here, and infractions of its laws are always punished, though less severely now than in the past. Divorces are not common, but a man can get rid of his wives if he will. One curious custom decrees that if a husband and wife have a quarrel and she leaves the hut and he shuts the door after her, that action alone is equivalent to a divorce, and the woman goes back to her own people at once. But let us go out into the country and look at some of the Kavirondo villages. I have visited many and have had no trouble whatever in going into the houses. There are numerous little settlements scattered over the plains between here and the hills, with footpaths running from village to village. Most of them are small, a dozen huts or so forming a good-sized settlement. The roof usually projects beyond the walls of the hut, covering a sort of veranda, a part of which is enclosed. There are poles outside supporting the roof of the veranda. The huts are usually built around an open space and are joined by fences of rough limbs and roots, so that each collection of huts forms a stockade in which the animals belonging to the village can be kept at night. Sometimes a village may be made of a number of such circles, each collection of huts belonging to one family. One of the shacks is for the polygamous husband and one for each of his wives. Let us go inside one of the houses. We stoop low as we enter. The floor is of mud with a few skins scattered over it. The skins are the sleeping places. Notice that little pen at the back littered with dirt. That is where the goats sleep. The chicks are put in that tall basket over there in the corner and are covered up until morning. Except for a few pots, there is practically no furniture. The cooking is done in clay vessels over that fire in the center of the hut, and the food is served in small baskets, the men eating first and the women taking what is left. Outside each house under the veranda is the mill of the family, which consists of a great stone with the hole chipped out of the center. The women grind Indian corn or sorghum seed in such mills, pounding or rubbing the grain with a second stone just a little smaller than the hole. In the grinding, bits of the stone come off and are mixed with the meal, often causing chronic indigestion. Some of the older Kavirondo villages are nothing but cemeteries. The people are superstitious and want to be buried in the places in which they have lived. When a chief dies, his body is interred in the center of his hut. He is placed in the grave in a sitting posture, just deep enough to allow his head and neck to be above ground. The head is then covered with an earthen pot, which is left there until the ants get in and clean off the skull. After this, the skull is buried close to the hut or within it, and the skeleton is taken out and reburied on some hilltop or other sacred place. Ordinary people are buried in their own huts, lying on their right sides with their legs doubled up under their chins. The hut is then left and forms a monument to the dear departed. Where there have been epidemic diseases, one may sometimes find a whole village of such houses occupied only by the dead. The huts are left until they fall to pieces. The Kavirondos are a stock-raising people. I see their little flocks of sheep and goats everywhere, and frequently pass droves of humped cattle. Fat cows graze over the plains, usually in droves watched by cowherds. Every drove has a flock of white birds about it. Some of the birds are on the ground, and some are perched on the backs of the cattle, eating the insects and vermin they find there. They are probably the rhinoceros birds, which feed on the flies and other insects preying on those great beasts, and which, by their flying, warn them of the approach of danger. The cattle are driven into the villages at night or into small enclosures outside. The women do the milking, but are not allowed to drink the milk, although they may mix it with flour into a soup. This Kavirondo country is very rich. All over the plains, from here to the mountains, the trees have been cut off, but the ground is covered with luxuriant grass. Near the villages are little cultivated patches in which the natives raise peanuts, Indian corn, and a millet-like sorghum. I see them everywhere digging up the black soil. Their naked bodies are almost as dark as the dirt they are hoeing. The British are developing the Kavirondos as general farm workers. Their wages range from 3 to 5 rupees a month. Around Lake Victoria and all along the Uganda Railway, large tracts of land have been taken up by Europeans, and some of this is being ditched and drained. I gather that it is the intention to turn the whole into one great cotton plantation, and see no reason why that should not be done. The End. End of chapter 36. End of Cairo to Kisumu by Frank G. Carpenter.